Okay, welcome, Ed. Thanks for joining today. Really great to have you on the call.
Hi Tim, yeah, lovely to be here.
Great. So Ed, obviously, founder of Hustle Badger, supporting PMs and PM and product teams, and a long time CPO. So really great to have a conversation with you today and just dig in a little bit around teams, around leadership. We're going to talk a bit about strategy as well, and obviously keen to hear about what's going on at Hustle Badger. But obviously, you must talk to product teams a lot. So I'd just first of all like to just learn or just know a little bit about what's kind of going on out there at the moment, how you're seeing teams working, and perhaps what's changing at the moment in the world of
Well,
product.
if you haven't noticed, a lot of people are talking about AI at the moment, and perhaps predictably, that is like genuinely probably the biggest thing that I'm seeing at the moment. And I guess we see that on almost like three levels. So there's the personal productivity level of like, oh, how do we use ChatGPT and Granola and all these other tools to make our lives a little bit easier and make us work a little bit faster. Then there's the way that we build things. So that's using tools like Lovable, Bolt, Replit for faster prototyping, for visualizing ideas and kind of creating digital products faster. And then the third way is actually
Yeah.
building AI capabilities into our own products. And the opportunities that opens up. So I think they're all quite different spheres and have their own advantages and opportunities and challenges. But it's an exciting time to be kind of playing around with these things, as well as in some cases quite a nerve-wracking time, full of pitfalls as well.
Do you see sort of quite a broad distribution of abilities in that way? Like, are there some companies that are just absolutely racing ahead with this stuff that you see where they have the mindset, like they recognize immediately we need to be on this? And I was talking to a CPO a couple of weeks ago where they were saying, in their company they've just bought everybody a subscription to whichever AI tooling they want to use, and they're really promoting it. But presumably there are some others who are sort of struggling with it and taking their time figuring out what to do.
It's actually much less varied than I expected, because I
Oh,
expected,
interesting.
big companies, incumbents to be really dragging their heels on this, to be worried about the security aspects or the cost aspects, and these sorts of things. And what I'm seeing is that even companies that I'm expecting to be, a little bit slower are really kind of, this is something that's on their mind. This is something they're already playing around with, and they're adopting to a much
Right.
greater degree than I might have expected.
Okay, interesting. And then, I mean, the prototyping capability, and obviously, mentioned Replit and others. I think that's really exciting, but I can see potentially clashes there with kind of engineering and other parts of the business. Obviously, designers get a bit cross sometimes when product managers fire up Figma and sort of start playing around in that. Do you think the same thing will happen with code and with prototypes
I
and
mean,
engineering?
I have heard of a couple of people getting a bit frustrated that they've basically built features in these low code tools, and then they're getting frustrated that they can't deploy them. But that's generally for like quite simple, often internally facing functionality. I think generally anyone who plays around with these tools is going to realize that we're not going to get rid of designers or PMs or engineers anytime soon, right? But the boundaries between those roles might get a little bit more blurred, and
Yeah.
the way that what does a good workflow look like is probably going to change. Like just the steps that you typically go through, is it going to be spec and then wireframe and then lo-fi and then hi-fi? I mean, probably not. It's probably going to be I have a chat with some kind of AI and just see a bunch of options visually and discuss that amongst the team,
Yeah.
and then go and do something else, right? But no one really knows what that new workflow looks like. And I think that's kind of what's the interesting thing, right? Everyone's figuring that out.
Yeah, I think it's fun. And I mean, there's certainly echoes of, I mean, I remember, a while ago, I sort of started out as a designer and as a graphic designer, and then moved into kind of web and product and all that sort of stuff. And at one point there was a big push for kind of designing in the browser with a view to, basically getting it into the hands of customers as quickly as possible. So you'd create something pretty hacky, but still you could play around with it and see how it responded. And I think there's almost echoes of that here, right? You can create something that's not going to scale, but you can test very, very quickly in pretty realistic
Yeah, absolutely.
environments.
Yeah, I mean that's the one of the big strengths we're seeing at the moment.
Yeah, nice. Okay, and then you talked about. I really love the way you articulated those kind of three strands, and then the kind of third strand was obviously trying to add more value to your product by embedding AI, and I again I think here there's one of those things where potentially. We're going to get AI fatigue a little bit as products just try and get anything AI in there without really having a clear direction. Really keen to hear your thoughts on, how product, presumably there's lots of product teams out there with, CPOs or CEOs shouting at them, we need AI. And, how should they address that? And how should they make sure that they're going to deploy this stuff in a way that is actually valuable rather than just kind of noise?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I certainly see that a lot of CEOs, boards are putting pressure on their teams to do AI stuff. And I think, unfortunately, a lot of those teams are then failing at the first hurdle, which is they're not giving their teams access to the tools or maybe the CEOs don't even realize that, right? But actually getting access to the tools is then being bogged down in procurement and risk and legal and compliance. And we're at a stage where people really need to have access to lots of different tools. They need to be deliberately experimenting with different tools. They need to be doing little test cases and test projects in multiple different tools to see how they work so that they can understand what the use cases are, when they work, when they don't work, and they can then go from that basis. So asking a team just to kind of build AI things without giving them that flexibility and that opportunity is just, it's kind of wasting people's time, really.
Yeah, completely. Yeah, and I've certainly heard of some companies doing, kind of hack days with Lovable and stuff like that to just get them like immersed in this stuff and thinking about it as a first stage. I think as you're advocating, to then figure out like how can we apply this to our context and our
Yeah,
product.
absolutely. I think that's a great way of doing it, right? I think it's, give people the time. I think more often than not, the barriers to getting going are mental barriers rather than technical barriers. And people, they've almost think, they just can't face picking up another tool. And so they kind of leave it off to one side. And as soon as they get past that and actually have a play around, they realize it's pretty easy, it's pretty fun, like you can do cool stuff with it. And then they have 10 more ideas about how they want to go and use it going forwards.
Yeah. And I'm just actually going back a bit, reflecting on that kind of workflow piece as well, because I think the more I think about it, I think the more important that is as well. I sort of worry slightly for engineers. Obviously, product managers are famed for saying, it shouldn't be that hard, etc. And dumping a whole load of stuff on the engineering team. Obviously, not good product management, but it does happen. And I wonder whether this is going to alleviate or exacerbate that problem a little bit for our engineering.
I think it's
colleagues.
definitely going to alleviate it a bit, because one of the things that's really surprised me diving into some of these tools and then also speaking to other people who are doing that and teaching people to use the tools is that you immediately get a so much better understanding of how the code works. And that's from basic stuff about, there's separation between client and server code, and I need a database to store data, and this is how an API works. But then you also get into debugging and you realize how frustrating it is and how you don't know how hard it will be to fix a bug, because when you know how to fix it, it's fixed. So I think there's all sorts of things where playing around with these tools isn't just playing around with the tools, it's also learning to code. And because you're learning to code, you're developing empathy for coders who do that, full time.
Yeah, I think that's a fantastic answer and a great way of looking at it. Certainly, yeah. I mean, like you say, when you play around with these things, obviously, a lot of these tools promise the world, and the homepage sort of would suggest that you could go from zero to like fully functional iOS app in like a day or two. But as you say, the reality is actually very similar to coding properly, right? You try something, it doesn't quite work, you have to figure out how to work around it, or get over that blockage. And I think you're absolutely right. You get a much deeper empathy for the true challenges of building this stuff. I think that's a great insight. Okay, cool. So let's kind of move on a little bit. So we talked a little bit about it. Actually, what I do want to do before we do that is just think about, are you seeing, obviously, we talked about AI there, but are you seeing that have an impact on team sizes, the way teams are organized yet, or not so
I'm
much?
not seeing that yet. I think it's a little bit early to tell. I think there are probably some really cutting edge startups that have incorporated in the last year or two that have team sizes less than 30 or 40 people, right? Who are really building themselves ground up to be around AI and around agents, and they probably have slightly different ways of working and different team ratios. But in the bigger companies I'm seeing, it's just that hasn't become apparent yet about really like what are the long-term implications of organization structure.
Yeah, interesting. So I was talking to a product director this morning at a sort of 50-person startup, and he was saying that they're at sort of 50 people at the moment. They had 4 or 5 months ago they had hiring plans to be at 100 by the end of this year, but they've scaled that back because they think they can do more or they're seeing that they can do more with AI. But they are working in that space, and I would suggest they're right on that kind of cutting edge. So I think they're probably an edge case rather than the way all teams are working at the moment. There is some evidence, Ed, that there's kind of growth in senior roles, kind of senior product roles, and I don't know whether that's because of the market or there's something happening out there, or whether it's actually because being driven by excuse me, a lot of people wanting to move into senior roles. I speak to a lot of PMs who are keen to get into head of leadership positions. Just initially, your kind of thoughts on that. Is that something you're seeing?
I mean, I don't have a look at any of the quantitative data, so it's quite hard for me to see that. I mean, I hear anecdotally from people, but often that's because they are looking for jobs themselves. So I get this impression that everyone's looking because those are the people I hear from. And I hear from a lot of people who are trying to break into fractional or coaching roles, because that's obviously like an area I've touched on myself. I mean, certainly my impression is that just the bench is a bit deeper these years than it was, say, even 3 or 4 years ago, just because product management as a discipline is that much older. And I remember, 15 years ago, being in London, and that, most people didn't know what a product manager was. And, people who could really claim to have more than a handful of months of experience were extremely thin on the ground. And now you do have a bunch of people who have been doing this for 10 plus years, and therefore are credible as real leaders.
Yeah, interesting. And so what would your advice be? So for people thinking about or wanting to move into those kind of head off positions, I guess firstly it might be interesting to know from your perspective, what you see as the differences. There's a lot of titles around, right? There's a lot of head of, VP, CPO, director. How do you see those roles split out initially? Let's get some definitions going, and then we can maybe talk about the way to
absolutely. I mean, I see there being 4 kind of main bands, and the titles obviously vary a little bit between different companies. So your first band is your kind of IC role, which might be a junior PM, PM, senior PM, etc. And you're doing the work, you're working directly with engineers. And then above that, you've got your kind of manager role. So that is often a group PM or a head of product role, maybe even a lead PM. Titles are quite common. So those people are, they're hiring and coaching individual contributors. They're often doing quite a lot of the strategy work, if we're honest. And they are coordinating between, maybe 3 to 6 different teams and making sure there's an integrated strategy between them. But they're typically operating within a framework that has been set by someone else. So the third level up, you're then at the sort of VP, director level, where you are the most senior person who is only managing product managers. So you are then
Okay.
running the whole discipline for the company.
Yeah.
And then you are obviously coming up with the product strategy and you're cascading that through your group product managers. But more importantly, you're
Yeah.
designing and running the operating model for the product team. So you're deciding what are the reporting you're getting, what are the check-ins you're doing, how are you going to do quarterly planning, or midweek planning. Are you even doing OKRs, or are you doing something else? And so that's the kind of the third level. And then above that, you've got maybe a CPO or a CPTO or a CIO even. You've got someone who is a true executive, but because they are a true executive reporting into the CEO, they are not just managing product managers. So they are also
Yeah.
going to be managing almost certainly design and quite
Yeah.
possibly data engineering, customer support, other functions which they do not have the deep technical expertise in, but they still need to, drive performance and they're accountable for results of that function within the company.
Okay, that's a really nice way of explaining it. I like those kind of clear differentiators actually, because I think obviously titles can be confusing, and we've all seen. Well, actually, I've been a head of product at a company where I was the only product manager initially when I first startup I joined, and I think some people find themselves in that position, and you also see I think sometimes companies hiring. Like hiring a CPO when actually, there's only 50 people in the business and really it's not a sort of C-suite role. So I think those different definitions are really useful. And then, so, if I'm in IC, for example, at the moment, what should I be doing to try and kind of collect the experience and the artifacts that would help me to move into a head of role?
I mean, all of the transitions between these different roles, which includes, becoming a PM in the first place, they're all slightly catch-22 positions because people want to have, know that you've got the experience of doing the job before, and you can't get experience of doing the job until someone gives you the job. So it's like, how do you get the proxies and how do you get close enough that jump does not seem quite as big? The gap between where you are and where you want to be isn't as big, and people are willing to give you that break. And if you can do that internally, that's often a really nice way of doing it. If your company is big enough that you can take on a single junior PM as a mentee, if not as a direct report, are they're on your team because your team is a bit bigger than usual. It's not kind of 6 engineers, it's more like 10 engineers and you need another person to coordinate things. That's a nice halfway house. So those kind of player coach roles. But I think if that's not possible, then really you're looking at that. Where do you get that leadership and line management experience from, and how do you show that you can deliver results when you're not getting involved in things yourself? And that's quite a big change, right? It certainly surprised me even realizing that was going to be a big shift, just how big a shift it was, and all the things I'd learned as an IC weren't really going to be effective as a head of product.
Yeah, I think that's a really key point about suddenly as a head of product, you're delivering through the team rather than delivering yourself. And I think that's a challenge. I mean, it's a classic thing, isn't it? You get really good at doing something and somebody says, okay, I'm going to promote you now. Don't do that anymore. You've got to let these other people do it. And learning how to do that, I think, is very difficult. And you're right. It only seems to, the only way you can do it is by actually doing it. So kind of building up that trust, I guess, to be promoted into that position or moving into that position, I think is the challenge. And I guess a lot of people move into it, if they're not promoted, they move into that role by proving that they've done it a lot and then hopefully get hired into a head of, perhaps in a smaller organization or even a larger organization where there's another layer above you who can help provide that.
Exactly.
leadership.
And I think, absolutely that, if you can be a really experienced product manager, then you can sometimes make those kind of moves outside your organization to somewhere that just has a need for it. And the difficulty there is that you've got to really clearly show that there's clear water between you and whoever you're going to be managing, for you to be a credible
Yeah.
leader. And so there's that question of like, why aren't they promoting someone internally? Maybe they just got a very junior team, for example. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Okay, great. And then, so I want to make sure we have some time to kind of chat about strategy. And you mentioned it there. I think it seems to be something that comes up a lot at all levels of product. I know a lot of product managers. One of the reasons they want to get into leadership is because they want to get more involved in strategy. I've always had a sneaky suspicion that whether that's because they don't feel like the strategy in their organization is good enough, or whether they just don't like the sort of day-to-day grind of PM, and strategy seems a bit more glamorous. I'm not sure what it is. Yeah, I know you kind of write a lot and talk a lot about strategy, Ed, and I think it's a fascinating area. So keen to sort of pick your brains around that. I suppose there's a few areas that might be interesting to explore. I mean, first off, just understanding a bit more about kind of what product strategy is and how it relates to commercial strategy, and let's kind of start off there.
Yeah,
Perhaps.
absolutely. And look, I think people can get a little bit hung up on the semantics. So for me, a product strategy is just a plan of what you're going to do and why you're going to do it. And it has, I think, maybe a couple of kind of really key elements to it. The first is it should be focused on higher than average impact. So, this is by definition, if you're going to, you can't do everything. So the things that you're going to select to do should be more effective than the things that you're not going to do. And strategy for me also implies that you haven't just picked those things individually as being the highest ROI, return on investment initiatives. There's actually some overarching philosophy behind them, which means that they are mutually reinforcing, so that you don't get a kind of 1 + 1 = 2 effect when you do those things. You get a kind of 1 + 1 = 3 effect.
Yeah, nice. And who would normally be responsible for pulling that together?
So for my mind, that's usually, I mean, it happens at different levels, right? So a VP or a director will usually be responsible for pulling together the product strategy across the company level, and that's something that they're going to derive from the company strategy. But then also at the way that they express that strategy is by deciding what teams they need and which problems they're going to allocate those teams, right? So for me, at an executive level, or that kind of leadership level, strategy is resource allocation. And then at the team level, you're given a problem space, you've got a team, your strategy is like, well, what are you actually going to build, feature by feature? What are the things that you think are going to have impact?
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, that makes sense. And then, so how do I think one of the reasons product strategy or product managers talk about strategy so much is because I think a lot of product people are toiling under bad strategy, which doesn't give them the clarity to be able to really. I mean, I see it almost as an umbrella, right? If you've got a good strategy, it's very clear what decisions, or you feel like you have the agency rather to make decisions, and you have the umbrella of strategy over you. I think if you don't have a good strategy, that's incredibly tough, and people end up almost spread betting, right? We're going to try loads of different things, and they won't be quite right, but at least we're doing work, and we're sort of hopefully progressing. So I mean, I do think it's on leaders to, one of the most important things they can do is really give clarity throughout that strategy and help people to understand what they shouldn't be working on as much as what they should be working on. And how can you, as a leader, do that? And also kind of, I'm interested in sort of how you reinforce that really and make sure that the strategy is understood and clear across the team.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, it's so common to see leadership teams are not really prioritizing. They're not kind of having that discipline, and so there is no real strategy, right? You're not saying no to enough stuff, even if you're saying no to some stuff. And I think there are a few maxims and mottos that I like. One of them is leadership is not about saying no to bad ideas. Or strategy is not about saying no to bad ideas. It's about saying no to good ideas so you can focus on great ideas, right? And another maxim that I kind of try and impress on leadership teams is, if it's not painful, it's not really prioritization, right? Like
Yes.
these are difficult decisions,
Yes.
right? That's why you are in a leadership role, is to make these difficult decisions. And if you do not make those difficult decisions, that is an abdication of responsibility, and you are condemning the teams below you to have suboptimal impact. So, yeah, I mean, there's no two ways around that. I think that's, sometimes politics get in the way, but some of the tactics that I use personally is also just really laying out, well, what is the capacity we've got? And again, going back to that, strategy of resource allocation, if you sort of point out, well, look, 3 months in the quarter or 12 months in the year, this is how we will spend our time. When you fill that
Yeah.
time up with too many different initiatives, you can kind of point out, look, that means we've only got a team, for 1 month on this thing. And in 1 month, well, look, let's look at what we've built in the last, 6 months in a month. It's not going to be very much.
Yeah.
So when you start to
Yeah.
make that a bit more visible for people, then you can start to communicate, look, we can do 20 different things, but you're going to get 20 very, very small little things. And actually, maybe it would be better to
Yes.
focus on 3 things and do them to a much greater depth.
Yeah, definitely. I think that's great. I always quite enjoy, if a company's working on kind of 2-week sprints, I always quite enjoy calculating how much those 2-week sprints are costing in terms of, salary, and then whether the relevant value is being generated out of over a quarter or whatever it might be that kind of matches that. Because I think it's always quite stark when you see the tens or hundreds of thousands of pounds going into a 2-week effort, and are we getting that much value out as well?
Yeah, absolutely. It's one of my favorite tasks as well.
And then if you are sort of an ICPM and you feel like you're as you put it, kind of toiling under a sort of inefficient strategy, what can you do? So what can one do to start to almost manage up, I guess, to sort of try and get some focus and clarity?
Yeah, it's a great question, and it's unfortunately both common and not easy. So what I always recommend to people to do is to effectively write their own strategy, and not as a sort of like, well, this is the strategy and now you've got to follow me, but you can sort of say, hey, look, my understanding of what we should be doing is XYZ. So these are the assumptions I'm inputting to my work. Stop me if I'm wrong, kind of thing. And then to be really tight on, having a plan of, an estimate of the impact they're going to deliver, and then reporting on whether they delivered that impact or not. Because you can then have the discipline that you're hoping and expecting the rest of the organization should have. And even if you don't get the rest of the company to come with you, you're at least showcasing that you're acting at the top of your game.
Yeah, brilliant. And I think going back to one of our earlier sort of areas of conversation, I think it's a great way of flagging that you're maybe ready for a leadership role as well, right? If you're taking on the agency and you're displaying those kind of behaviors, and like you say, you're modeling that kind of behavior, then I think that's a really great way to go as well. Yeah, nice. Okay, good. And I know that on Hustle Badger, you have a ton of great resources around all of this stuff. Just before we wind up, Ed, I'd love to just learn a bit more about Hustle Badger, why people should subscribe, and perhaps anything that's coming up that's exciting.
Yeah,
in the
super.
future.
Well, look, I set up Hustle Badger 2.5 years ago because I was going into a lot of different roles as a product leader, a VP or a CPO, and I was helping the teams upskill and mature in terms of the output that they could deliver. And so with Hustle Badger, what we've done is basically documented all of those techniques, and they're very pragmatic, step-by-step guide. There's a big focus on it being incredibly actionable so people can use things immediately. That means we have a lot of templates that people can start to work with straight away. We have a lot of very thorough guides that you can read in 10, 15 minutes, but will tell you not just about the theory of how you might do something like quarterly planning or designing a new feature, but also the common pitfalls and traps that you'll run into, and some of the tactics to get by them. So we have all of those resources online, but what we're doing more and more of is working with product leaders who want to upskill their teams. And so we're not only giving them access to all the digital resources, which their teams can access sort of on a as need basis, but we're then pairing that with a program of workshops, which then specifically targets the areas where they feel their teams could use a bit more support.
Yeah, that sounds fantastic, and I love that kind of dual track approach, right? So you can it sounds like you can kind of self-serve, but if you need to go deeper and need a bit more support, you're there for hands-on kind of support as well.
Yeah,
It sounds brilliant.
yeah, and we're certainly finding that's very effective because it generates a sort of common language amongst the product teams. A lot of our customers are using that as an opportunity to bring their product teams together, and it really helps sort of establish what some of the the norms and expectations are for being a product manager in your organization.
Yeah, superb. Look, Ed, thank you so much for finding the time to chat. That's been incredibly interesting and useful. So yeah, thanks very much for finding some time to have a chat, and hopefully
Not
speak
at
to you
all.
again
Thanks
soon.
for having me on.
Awesome.